Good evening. I hope everyone on Zoom can see and hear us. If not, I'll fix that after I introduce our speaker. Welcome to the Wayland Library. Tonight we are excited to have Wayland's own Dennis Vaccaro here to share his expertise and adventures in wilderness backpacking. Dennis grew up in Pittsfield, where he did a lot of hiking and camping while in the Boy Scouts. He's an Eagle Scout and was a campcraft counselor at Camp Eagle in the Berkshires and Camp Alpine on Cape Cod. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in biology from Tufts and a Ph.D. in Physiology from Harvard. Dennis has been hiking and backpacking since the 1960s and has covered several thousand wilderness miles. So thank you so much to Dennis for being here tonight. Just a couple of notes. We are recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access channel, and for YouTube, so you'll be able to rewatch and share after the presentation, probably a few days after the presentation. And Dennis will be speaking, and please raise your hand, or if you are on Zoom, enter any questions in the chat at any time, and I will read them aloud to him. And now I think I'm done with my housekeeping. So welcome, Dennis.
Thank you. And I want to thank Courtney and the Wayland Library for allowing me to do this. I really appreciate that. So hello to everybody out in space as well as here. And thank you for tuning in. So I am going to be talking about wilderness backpacking. And I want to say right at the start of things that pictures just don't do it compared to actually being out there. But nevertheless, I think we have some pretty good pictures here. Okay. I am not going forward.
Try the space bar.
Oh, the space bar. No. Some technical difficulties. Okay, so we are still backpacking every year. My college roommate and I, we have an annual backpacking trip. And this was us fairly recently in the Canyonlands area of Utah. And this is us a few years ago, I think in the late 70s maybe. And I don't know how exactly we got the idea that blue jeans and shirts with collars was what you backpack in, but apparently back then. And I have this hat from that. And I want to tell you, Loring can't find his, so anyway, and this was a backpacking hat? I don't understand it, but I guess I did at the time. Okay, so this is a brief history of backpacking for me. In the 1960s, backpacking was a thing, but it wasn't that popular of a thing out there. The Boy Scouts did it, but not too many other people. But I learned to love camping in the Boy Scouts. And growing up in western Massachusetts, we had a lot of advantages. And actually, the Appalachian Trail was only a mile or two away from where I lived. So I was aware of that when I was very young. I did teach campcraft at Camp Eagle, which was the Boy Scout camp in the Berkshires, and then another camp on Cape Cod. So it was just something I loved. My parents, on the other hand, thought this whole hiking and camping thing was just entirely crazy. My father was in World War II, and he couldn't imagine that anybody would voluntarily want to go out there and be miserable. But anyway, I was a new generation, so that was that. I had a good friend whose father hiked a long trail when it was basically brand new. So that was really our inspiration for starting some relatively serious backpacking. And as a result, when I was at Camp Eagle over 3 summers in the mid-'60s, we actually section hiked the long trail end to end. And at that point, you know, the trail wasn't entirely done, let's just say still. So it was always an adventure. There was basically nobody out there in the 60s, so sometimes you found yourself fighting with the animals for space in shelters, but that was just part of the way things were. And of course, backpacking food at the time was quite primitive, and it was totally okay to bring plenty of cans of something or other along, and I'll be showing something about that a little later. Okay, so the Long Trail. I wanted to get into a little history about the Long Trail because we're in New England and we're proud. The Long Trail was really the first long-distance trail in the U.S., and it was conceived by James Taylor, not that James Taylor. This was another James Taylor, in 1909. And then it was built sometime by in between 1910 and 1930 by the good people of the Green Mountain Club. It runs the length of the Green Mountains in Vermont, and I've seen different numbers. 272 is what the GMC says. And it goes straight from the Canadian border, and we were there, down to the Berkshires and Massachusetts. There are 3-sided shelters every 5 to 7 miles, so very convenient. And the guy who thought up the Appalachian Trail was actually hiking the Long Trail and thought that was a good idea. We just need to extend it a little longer by a couple of thousand miles. And also the Long Trail and the Appalachian Trail are the same for the southern 100 miles or so. So they do get along. This is a shot from, I think, Mount Mansfield, looking down the length of the Green Mountains, and off on the right side is actually potentially views of Lake Champlain. It's just gorgeous. So speaking of shelters, we were on the 100-mile wilderness, which is part of the Appalachian Trail in Maine in 2020, and we got some shots of what I would say are a classic shelter. And then along with every shelter, you have to have an outhouse. And in the old days, outhouses were just outhouses. Now they have names like Full Moon and Fort Relief. I didn't show you that one. So somebody has a sense of humor now in the AMC up there. But this gives you an idea of what these things look like. So why did I do this? And I mean, really. So here I'm caught in a cactus patch and don't know what I'm doing here. And actually, I'm standing on the trail, so it's no problem. But really, when I tried to think about why Loring and I would want to do this, it's because of many things. It's the challenge, both physical and mental. You find yourself often having to figure it out, you know, where's the trail, how are we going to get up this thing, things of that sort. Of course, the scenery is so beautiful it hurts. And even the lousy days can be fabulous. You have a real sense of going back in humanity, of sort of having a taste of what how our ancestors lived out in the wilderness. We bring along favorite books and we read them in the wilderness, so we're not hiking all the time. And I'll talk about that in a little bit too. We love sleeping under the stars, so we don't have a tent. We do have a tarp, but we try not to use it. And solitude, it's just amazing, the solitude that we're able to achieve in the 21st century, especially out in the West in the Rocky Mountains and stuff. I'll show you some pictures of that later. And then there are all kinds of magical things that are going on, like the geology, looking at those canyon walls and fossils and the things that ancient peoples left behind. And then there's a sense of accomplishment once it's completed successfully. And then we have a sense of seeing it before it's gone, because over the years we've seen so many changes. And the last thing I want to leave you with is there's a saying, hike your own hike. So some people like to do through hiking, some people like to climb things. We like to just go out and enjoy the wilderness, especially at our age, because we're not breaking any records. Okay, so how do we decide to go? Every year, Loring and I, for the past 40 or so years, go every year. And the fun part is all year long, we try to figure out where we want to go this year. And so it's always mountains versus canyons. So the mountains in September, canyons in October. Why do we go then? Because there are no bugs and people are back to school. So the chance for solitude is greater there. We have to find a trail that's something like 60, 80 miles, 10 to 12 days. We're looking for solitude, so national parks are pretty much out, or even favorite places. So we go to the places where no one else wants to go. We always are interested, especially in the desert, about hearing about water. And these days, you got to really find out about the fire situation wherever you're going. And thank God for the rangers, because they really help us to do the right thing out in the wilderness, and we really rely on them. So a typical trip is we arrive bright and early at Logan Airport, and then we try to have a flight that gets us to the destination airport around noonish, so that then we can rent a suitable vehicle, and then we pick up crucial things for the trip, like fuel for the stove, cocktails for cocktail hour, water, and maybe bear spray. Sometimes, yes, sometimes. Mostly we don't do bear spray, but sometimes we're advised to do that. We drive the 4 or 5 or 3 hours out and park at the trailhead, and we like to literally be at a campsite that evening of the day that we leave. And then we go ahead and do the trip, and then we get back to the motel, and then we shower, because you're not going anywhere unless you shower. And that first dinner in civilization obviously is indescribable, and then fly home. So this is not a complete list, but of course, what each of us carries is, because there has to be some redundancy in case you have to be prepared. So obviously we have a backpack, sleeping bag, a mat, a ground cloth, all kinds of clothing things. Crocs are important not only for taking your boots off at the end of the day, but for crossing streams, you'll see. And, hiking poles, we used to not use them. Now we find they're invaluable for going up, going down, and also for the tarp, being able to put the tarp up sometimes. Headlamps are just fantastic now. First aid, knife and spoon. Kindle. This is one of the most important pieces of camping gear you can have, because we used to bring things called books, but we were always worried we would run out of reading material. Not a problem with Kindle. Now we worry about the battery. Okay, we bring plenty of gear to replace anything that's broken. Ropes end up being very valuable. Sunglasses, especially when you're up at 12,000 feet, important. Camera, you wouldn't have the pictures. And various water container, personal food. I have some things I like that I'm not sharing with Laurie. Yes?
Oh, a question from the Zoom. Do you wear a bug net while you're cowboy camping in buggy areas?
We don't have bugs. We don't allow them. There are no bugs, especially in the snow. So no, we don't ever actually have that challenge for the most, except once in one in a million sort of circumstances. So so that's why we go in the fall. Good question though. Compass, and then there are about 100 other things that I couldn't list, so I put miscellaneous. So then Loring and I have it all worked out after 40 years of who carries what. And somehow we end up carrying the same amount of weight. I don't know how that happens. It's a miracle. But I bring food for breakfast, lunch, and snacks, and cocktail hour, the most important hour of the day, which goes on for more than an hour. I bring a water purifying gizmo, which used to be chemicals, and then it became and then it became more chemicals, chlorine. Loring had a chlorine thing. But now we have UV irradiation for killing viruses. And so far, after, I don't know how long we've had these, about 10 years, nobody's gotten from Giardia or anything. So that seems to work.
How does that work?
It's a UV light. So you dip it into your canteen or your water bottle and stir it around until it tells you to stop. And then you're good to go. And you try to get clean, pure water to start with. We somehow press a button. It's, the press button world.
So you can get that at REI or?
Oh, yeah. Yep, they all have them. Then, due to popular demand, we bring along a SOS device, which also happens to be a GPS, which also can send texts and emails to the folks back home to let you know that you're still alive. And we really resisted bringing this thing on trips, but now it's a must-have.
Someone's asking, what about toilet paper?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Can you hold that question for a second? I anticipated that question, and I will have the answer. So also I carry the pots and the cups and bear spray if such. Loring does the freeze-dried food for dinner. He's stuck with the tarp. He has to deal with the stove and the fuel. He brings the beverages, tequila. No, we don't bring beer, too heavy. So got to have a lot of alcohol. Maps, he has a great cell phone for GPS, and then he also has a gizmo that does weather forecasting and things like that, altitude. Okay, so leave no trace camping. This is something we try to observe. Whatever you carry in, you carry out. Try to camp away from water and the trail if possible. We actually prefer to do that. We camp at sites that have been used before or on rocks. So we used to do campfires. Now we don't do campfires anymore because we're afraid. Just out west, it's just no toilet paper. So Loring was the pioneer in getting rid of toilet paper because we went to a place called the Maze where they made you carry it out. And he didn't like that, especially he didn't like that. So he figured out something. I still carry toilet paper, but after a few years, I got converted over. So we do not bring toilet paper. We also do not use leaves. And we know poison ivy. But we do use things like, if you can believe it, we prefer pine trees. That's a unidirectional toilet paper. If you go the other way, it's going to be a problem. But there's always something of that sort that you can use, so it's all natural. I hope that answers the question. And don't touch anything, and don't scare the wildlife. That's just the good thing in general. We do a lot of talking, and you don't want to scare the hunters. So that's especially the case because I'll say we're going in the hunting season. I'll get to that. In our younger days, as I often mentioned, we didn't think much about physically preparing for a trip. Now that we're somewhat older, and actually in our, should I say it, 70s? How did that? It's got to be a year-round activity. Also, the early trips were 3 to 5 days on that sort. Now we do more like 10 to 13 days. So it's all upside down and backwards. When we were more fit, we did less. And now that we're old and grizzled, we do more. These are the hardest trips. So anyway, we'll have to figure that out in the next talk. So we do both cardiovascular and weights. I walk with a 50-pound pack around town. training, and it's possible somebody out there may have seen me, and I'm that guy. As I always say, yeah, I'm that guy. Okay. Oh, yes.
Sorry, an age question. What is the minimum age of backpacking? We have a young boy who's interested in this type of adventure.
Well, let's say I would think, well, it depends upon how much weight. I mean, you can start just as soon as you think they're ready. But, oh no.
Loring says he hiked sections of the Appalachian Trail with his kids when they were about 5 and 7.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay. I'm a physiologist, so supposedly I should know the answer to that question. But that's another good question. Okay, so now we're going to the trail, and I think over the years our most favorite way of getting to the trail was to take the Durango and Silverton steam locomotive out of Durango, and they take you out and they drop you off at Elk Park. This is us getting off the train, and everybody was looking at us from that car thinking those guys are crazy, because it was not that fun weather at that point. And we were the only ones getting off. In the summertime, there are like zillions of people, because there's a famous area called Chicago Basin that has a bunch of 14ers. But in all our years, this was the best way to get to the trailhead. So let's start hiking. And I love this picture because you can see the trail go and go and go and go. So I'm going to talk about mountains first, and then I'm going to talk about canyons, and just show a few slides of the kind of views you can have. And this is one of our favorites in the Wind River Range up in Wyoming. And that's Square Top Mountain. That's a famous mountain. And this was our second trip to the Wind River Range last year. So the first one was the northern part, and this was more the central part. And the rangers told us we might have a problem with water, but there were plenty of lakes and streams and everything, so we didn't. But this is a scene, and this is only showing a portion of it, that was our view from camping, and there was no one. Zero. We only saw 2 people on the whole trip once we got away from the trailhead. It's just extraordinary. And this is Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. And just to have a sense of what we're contending with, more sawtooth. They were beautiful. And these are the high Uinta Mountains in Utah. These are a range of Rocky Mountains that go in the wrong direction. Instead of kind of north-south, they go east-west. So if you start at Salt Lake City and kind of go straight east, that's where these things are. And they're up between 10,000 and 13,000 feet, something like that. The highest peak in Utah is along this. But again, the views were just fabulous every second, because there were very few trees. Now, moving on to canyons. This is a place called Burr Point in Utah, not very far away from Canyonlands. And I chose this couple of pictures because they were the best to show the extent of, the big canyons you would see. And so we're around 1,500 feet above the Dirty Devil River, which is flowing through the valley there. And this is looking in the other direction. And you can see the river meandering. And you can see it's brown. So you have to learn how to drink that water, but that's another story for another talk. But on the other hand, canyons can be wide, or they can be very, very narrow. And they're even much narrower than this if you get into a slot canyon. But it's really quite the experience to have this thing go up 1,000 feet or 500 feet, and you're in this little area. Okay, so I want to highlight the trip to the maze because this is an incredible area. So it's in Utah, and to describe it, was our first trip to the west. Loring had been interested in going for years because he spent some time in Albuquerque, And then our first trip in 2003, we went out to the maze. And it's a very remote area that you have to drive 45 miles on a dirt road just to get to the ranger station. It is bordered by both the Green and the Colorado rivers with huge valleys going down. Its trails are basically unmarked. You need a 25-foot rope to lower your packs to get down into it. And a guy by the name of Edward Abbey wrote a book called Desert Solitaire, which is an homage to this whole area. And it talks about the love of, and in his case, the fighting for wilderness. He was a park ranger back in the 60s. So we're in the library. Desert Solitaire. I recommend it. So this area is heavily restricted. Permits are for a national park. Permits are required. Only about 2,000 visitors a year are allowed. It's often mentioned as one of the 10 most dangerous hikes in America, which is interesting because nobody's ever died in there, and I think everybody got out who went in. And we have to thank the rangers for that. Mount Washington, on the other hand, where many people have died, is rarely mentioned as a dangerous hike in America. I don't understand that. We have to be serious about the maze, though, because it is complicated and complex terrain. It's desert conditions. You really have to be experienced before going in there, and you really have to know how to find water because it's the desert. So on this first trip, which was our first time going out west, we realized that we were driving to get to the ranger station in the maze, we had to drive right by Blue John Canyon, where the 127-hour guy got stuck with his arm. And that was only just a couple of months or 3 months or so before we went out there. So he was still all over the news. So we thought, this is going to be perfect. Okay, so here is a view of the maze. And many layers, fabulous canyons. It's just so beautiful. And there are these famous standing rocks called the chocolate drops, which are Oregon shale topped with white rim sandstone caps that keep the bottom things from eroding away. And they're around 250 million years old. I have to give credit to Loring. He climbed the canyon wall up to these things to take this picture. So he gets the credit for that. I was down reading some book. So in the maze is this famous rock art, something called the harvest scene. And I got to tell you, it's not like being in the museum. When you see something like this out in its location, it's a religious experience. I mean, there's just no other way. I mean, it's just extraordinary, the feeling that you have. And I'm going to show some more stuff of seeing something done by a human being in this location, and you feel the presence of those people. It just... Okay, so I'm going to start going through various things we have to cope with, and of course, if you're in the desert, you have to find water, and sometimes it's difficult. There is Loring. I don't know why he's standing on a cliff collecting a drip, but you go with what you got. So he got up there and got some water for us. But other times, finding water is extremely easy, even out in the desert. And on our second trip to the maze, which was in a section of it called Ernie's Country, it poured before we arrived and while we were there. And so these little things of water here are called potholes. And we talked to the guys at the ranger station about the water, and they said, potholes, no problem. Don't even talk to us about it. So plenty of water on this trip. And it's rare that you go out on a backpacking trip hoping for rain. But when you're in the desert, you have things like that happen. So every day, at the end of the day, you have to search for the perfect campsite, because that's what you do on a backpacking trip, at least us. And this is one overlooking the Grand Canyon from the North Rim. And, no tarp, fabulous view. But we spend a lot of time discussing and, well, shall we hike a little further? So not all campsites end up being this perfect, but we love all of them. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the wildlife section, because people always ask, did you see any wildlife? And mostly the answer is no, and the reason will come up in a sec. But sometimes, yes, we see some significant wildlife. And the reason why we usually don't see wildlife is because we're hiking in hunting season. And it turns out the animals know. I don't know how they know, but somehow they have a calendar. And somehow they can read. But in hunting season, they are... Remember I showed you that scene in the Wind River Range, the broad view? There are no animals there either, as well as, we didn't see an elk, we didn't see nothing. We saw bear prints once. We did see a few deer prints, so they're like gone. Okay, but some wildlife is very aggressive, and butterflies seem to love me. The butterfly on the left just would not leave me alone. Loring was very amused by all of that. And then I found another picture of me with a butterfly. I don't understand it. So butterflies love me. And in fact, we found whole trees full of butterflies at one point along the Colorado River when we were in the Grand Canyon. But sometimes you run into more significant wildlife. So they can read. How do I know they can read? So this was in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. So we're hiking many miles to go into the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. And all of a sudden, there's a big sign that says something like Nature Preserve. I thought we had a picture of it, but I couldn't find one. Nature Preserve, no hunting, no anything. We were, I would say, no more than a couple of 100 feet into the wildlife preserve when we ran into these guys. And this is a picture that I took. I only took about one picture because I'm the bear spray guy, remember? So I was manning the bear spray. We're on the trail, and Loring is clicking away, taking pictures. And we're moving along. And they were like right there. We're moving along down the trail, and they're kind of not paying attention, but watching us a little bit. We move a little more, and apparently there's an agreement between the wildlife and the people who were on the trail. I think if we took one step off the trail, it would have been a different story. But as long as we were on the trail, they just, whatever they were eating, I think there were 3 at that point, they ate away. So how did they know? On another trip in Virginia, we were walking down a road, and we saw a couple of deer like way far away down the road. And they saw us, and they took off in a shot, and they ran into some barbed wire. Meanwhile, we're walking down this road because we're going to get picked up. Meanwhile, there's an entire herd of deer right here, not paying attention to us at all, like hundreds of them. Why? Because there were no hunting signs every 20 feet, and there were no hunting signs because if you shot that way, you'd hit the main road over there. So believe me, they can read. Okay, so we were at Eagle Cap Wilderness, and speaking of winter backpacking, so just before I arrived, we got 18 inches of snow up there, and we had to hike in and break the trail and all of that. So we're hiking in, and we're hiking in miles and miles and miles, and we get to the furthest point, and then we turn around and go back, and we think, we can hike in our own boot prints now. So we're hiking back, and this trail's been broken. And I don't know if you can see, but at one point, if you look inside of our boot prints, you can see bear tracks. So we're looking in there, and some bear had used our trail breaking to walk in, because they're not stupid. They're on the trail, and we broke the trail for them. And bears have feet in the back that they can't see. They never missed one of our footholds at all. And this went on for miles. Now, we never saw that bear. I don't know, most of the time there's just an understanding, but we just thought this was the most hilarious thing. So this guy followed us for miles. Every now and then he would break off and do something, and then but I love our footprints with the bear prints. Okay, they have a calendar. So I don't know if you can see, but there are a gazillion elk up on this mountainside nearby where we were camping. And I'll go to this picture so you get a better view. You know, there's a huge long line. And we're like, wow, we never see elks like this. And, you know, this guy, by the way, is watching us. But at one point during the hike, we ran into a ranger. And the ranger said to us, oh, you picked the best week to go backpacking because last week bow hunting season ended. And next week, the gun hunting season starts. So in this 1 week, they know they can't be shot. And that's why you can see them. And then he said to me, you know, they have a calendar. I said, yeah, and they can read too. He said, oh, yeah. So the other wildlife thing, so I've mentioned once or twice cocktail hour before, I think, during this talk. And so we were having cocktail hour, and all of a sudden a young elk comes down walking by us about 20 feet away. And sauntering by us. And now there's a river down there, but there's like 20 miles of river, so why here? I think this guy sent one of those teenage elks down to check us out. So that elk just sauntered right by. The next day, we happened to be at that same campsite. At around the same time, another elk came by. And this one was a little more nervous, so he was kind of like bing, 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 bing. And so they were checking us out, but we all got along. Okay, you have to show a couple of arch pictures if you're going to talk about the canyons. So this is a famous, Stevens Arch is famous. It's just gigantic, beautiful. And then this is an example of another arch that Loring managed to climb into. But there are big ones, there are small ones, they're all over the place. You don't have to go to arches or natural bridges to see them. They're kind of everywhere. And they're amazing. And finally we've arrived at cocktail hour. So Loring has taken a picture every year of us clinking our plastic cups for cocktail hour for 40 years. And somewhere he's got a whole presentation of all our pictures of us growing old, but we really enjoy that. And again, this is looking over the Colorado River in Ernie's country. Okay, every now and then we hit a mystery out there in the wilderness. And remember the obelisk that appeared out of nowhere? And well, that wasn't really the wilderness where that was. But we're in something called the 100-mile wilderness. And all of a sudden, we walk along, and there's this metal staircase out in the middle of nowhere. Now, there are probably 10,000 places where we could have used one of these things. This wasn't one of them. But either somebody is laughing a lot now, or I don't know what's going on, but we thought we were in another time or dimension or something like that. And this thing we ran into in Kanab Creek, Thunderbird, we don't know, but it was gorgeous. Somebody spent a lot of time. We think it might have been a Knowles group, one of these outdoor leadership training things, because they had been around. But a bunch of somebody's put in a lot of time for something that was going to wash away pretty soon. But it was definitely worth taking a picture of. Okay, so this has to be, I'm just going to declare it our best picture. Of course, Loring, who is out there at 5 a.m. drinking his coffee. And we're camped, obviously, by a lake. I'm back still under the tarp. All of a sudden, I heard kerplunk, 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 and I look out, and way off to the right, you could barely see a moose, and this moose kerplunked right by us, right at dawn. And Loring took a number of pictures. This is the most dawnest of all of those. But the moose just went by us, very casually. We don't need to panic. Very casually walked by us and went over someplace and was eating something. And then when we went over there later and found the places, so the moose had to get from where it was to where it wanted to have breakfast, and they had to walk by us, and we looked reasonably safe. So, but catching a moose in the lake at dawn, so thank you, Loring. And you can't have a talk without some sunrise pictures in Canyonlands with the standing rocks, or up in the high Uintas, sunset, and just seeing these things is just, you just can't describe it. And we only probably get 1 or 2 or 3 of these on a particular trip, so you gotta really love every one of them. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about cairns. So cairns were just kind of regular for many years. They were like 2 or 3 or 4 rocks, something like that, and they were useful. And people have painted blazes and things like that, but in some places you can't do that. So then in more recent years, people who were apparently on some kind of drug or something decided that they wanted to have more artistic cairns. And this one was not even the only one that was that big. I could have showed you several more pictures. But remember that whole leave no trace thing? So cairns are now out. You are supposed to leave everything natural. For God's sakes, you've got a GPS, and there's a rut, so you don't need to have any of this stuff ruining your view. So we've seen a progression of okay, absurd, back to nature in the world of cairns. And in fact, I think even blazes are, at least out west, they're not putting them up. They're taking down the signs. They're getting rid of signs. And a blaze is when you have you paint on a tree that marks where the trail is. Like the long trail, they're white, and then for the main trail, and then the side trails are blue. So, thank you for asking that question, because I'm operating on remote control here. So anyway, there does seem to be evolving a movement of not disturbing the wilderness at all. We get very sad when we hit an area that's burned, and that seems to be happening more and more out west. And these are roaring fires, so there's a lot of fuel on the ground, and I'll explain why a little bit later. Smokey the Bear was trying to do the right thing, but actually it ends up making it worse. So I'm going to talk about some of the artifacts that we saw, and especially when you're in canyon country, you run into a lot of ruins and rock art. I showed you a little bit before, but it's kind of everywhere, and you have to keep your eyes open. But then you hit a thing like this, right where it was and built, and there's a lot of this around. And sometimes they'll have something way up on the top of the cliff, and then sometimes it'll be right along where you are. depending upon whether it's storing food or, So clearly the environment, the weather, climate was different back then. So somewhere around 800 to 1200 CE. So I wanted to point out one thing this is called a perfect kiva. The kiva is an area where people would climb down into a room, and it was kind of a religious, as I understand it, a religious area. And this one was in just perfect shape. I don't think that was a 1,000-year-old ladder. I think that ladder was probably less than that. Loring went in first. Only after Loring came back out did I go in, because that's the kind of brave guy I am. And so there are these things out there that are just fabulous. Nothing grabs you more than seeing art where you see the imprints of people. So there were several locations where they would color their hands and put them on the rock, and that just grabs you in a way that's indescribable. I mean, you really feel the presence of our ancestors out there when you see things like this in real life. Okay, and then, they grew corn, and all over the place in certain areas are these little tiny, and I may be wrong, but I think they may be 1,000-year-old corn cobs that they were harvesting, and there were rocks for them. The rocks on the left there, they did some sort of mill work, and so you can see their workplaces, what they ate, and to leave no traces, you just have to leave everything, no matter, we saw lots of ceramic stuff all over, and it just was amazing. But every now and then you run into some not so ancient artifacts. Remember how I said cans of food were backpacking things for a while? Well, when the cowboys were out there, or wherever it was, they left their cans behind, and we don't touch those either. So we just leave everything right where it is. But we do run into these things, not quite as fascinating as the previous stuff. And then, of course, if you're in certain areas, there are fossils in the rocks just as you're walking by, and I don't know what these are, but there's something from a long time ago. What? Okay.
Sorry.
And and of course you have to think about safety. So, I'm the one who's carrying all the fresh food. So every night I hang the food, as you're supposed to do, up in a tree to keep it away from the bears. And on the right side, this is me down here. And here's the food up, sort of hung properly. But then you run into a circumstance where you don't have much in the way of trees around. So, but nevertheless, I still try to hang it, because there is really a much greater problem with mice than there are with bears in our experience out there. So, so the food gets hung no matter what. And then, this is just a little example of sometimes you have to bring your pack up and down cliffs. We had come down this thing, now we're going up it. And the good news is, unlike New England, where you could break your leg at every step because of the wet rocks, the rocks out west are dry and they're like sandpaper. So they're very, very grippy. So I like to say that this was a challenge and it was very difficult, but it's not that much of a challenge to go up or down these rocks from that perspective. Now, the more serious things are the river crossings that we have to do. Thank you very much, poles. I don't know how we managed to do it when we would try to find a stick, but the poles are really better, and there are a whole lot more rivers you end up having to cross than other things that you have to get around. This is me in the 100-mile wilderness. Now, I want to remind you that somebody built a staircase and put it in the woods in the middle of nowhere. All they did for me here, I don't know if you can see it, is that there's a rope to keep me from being washed downstream. But we did appreciate the rope. And it was probably some other backpacker who put it in. So there are a few leave no trace things that get ignored. And then, of course, here's the famous Dirty Devil River, which we crossed. It's always fun seeing a river in the desert. And anyway, okay, so Loring swims wherever he is, at whatever time of year. And I told Loring that I was certain there was a picture of him swimming with snow. And this is it. So this, remember the 18 inches, eagle cap, the bear tracks and our tracks. So this was on that trip. And he's out there with just a swimming suit on, doing something in the water. I don't even want to get near him. But you can see there's, Loring there. There's snow everywhere. But it doesn't matter, snow or no snow. This water is freezing. It's having a good time, doesn't he? And he is. So I have a whole bunch more of those pictures to show. I wanted to show this picture because on this trip, it was really kind of the first time that we hit smoke and you can see it over here in the canyon, and it was dense. We eventually got down into there a day or two later, and it was not fun. Fortunately, it lasted a day or so, but there was a fire off someplace, and it was filling up the canyons. And now, of course, we see giant plumes of smoke when we go out there. It's not that unusual anymore. And in fact, here in Boston, we've seen giant plumes of smoke recently that came right across the whole country. So I just wanted to show that as one example. So on the question of what kinds of changes have we seen over the years, and there's a whole lot less trash now than there used to be. In the 60s, at every shelter, there'd be a dump with cans in it. And even back then, we were kind of surprised at that. But we were happy to leave our cats there. But, all of that is gone. So, but even out in the wilderness, there's much less trash than there used to be. So people are really trying hard, I think. Again, on the campfire scene, there's much less of that because of the worry about fires. But also, we're just not doing it anymore. Much more smoke than there used to be out in the wilderness, especially out west, and way more forest fires. There are also a lot of forests that are entirely dead. You could look and see a whole mountainside of dead trees, and if you get a lightning strike in there, you're up and running in a second, because these trees are all softwoods and pines and things. So really, really scary every time I see that. And water, seems to be a bit more struggle now than there used to be. And the snowpack is, we get up high. There used to be snow that would carry through the summer. Now there seems to be a whole lot less of that than in our we only started 20 years ago when out there. But so anyway, so on the question of changes, those are some of the changes we've seen over time. So eventually, you come to the end of the trail, and you sadly look at your vehicle, and you get ready to go home, and you wonder how it all happened so fast. It's getting faster and faster every year. It just seems like we're moving too fast. And I'll leave you with the last slide of all the trips in the modern era. We did go backpacking in the 60s and 70s when we were in college, and then we stopped for a few years. And Loring said, "Oh, time to get going." And so we've gone virtually every year except for a couple of children and one broken ankle. And there were a couple of canoe trips in there. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Backpacking.
Any more questions?
More questions? Because I have more slides if you're willing to sit around. No questions there? Okay, well, if there are no questions.
I had a question. How long did it take you to go through the 100-mile wilderness?
Well, so we did it in two pieces. So the 50-mile portion took us about 10 days, but most people hike it way faster than that. You know, we were just moseying along.
Is it steep or is it just kind of a flat?
There are steep sections, and the southern part, you climb over some significant mountains. Most of the thru hikers that we met, though, said that this was the most beautiful section of the AT, in their opinion, the 100-mile wilderness. The 100-mile wilderness is kind of not a wilderness. They only say that because there are no paved roads and no towns in that 100-mile section. So it's the longest section of the AT that has that. On the other hand, there are lots of dirt roads that go through. In fact, that's how we did the 50 miles. We drove in and parked our car at the 50-mile point on a road, and then we had another guy drive us around to up by Katahdin, and then we hiked south to the car. So you don't have to hike the whole 100 miles, but it's really beautiful, and it looks like, you know, it's just green everywhere. It's like a hobbit place, if I can describe it that way. You expect to find little people running around, and it's especially in the fall. I mean, what can you say?
There's a question, what was the most harrowing experience or how you overcame that challenge?
The most harrowing experience. Well, you know, we haven't ever really had a really bad one. You know, we often have to revise a trip. So, for example, the 18 inches of snow, I mean, you could call that, we were hiking into that. And we met a guy going out who looked at us and he said, well, it looks like you can do it. So, you know, so we've had that. We had, you know, climbing down some of those canyons are, you know, sometimes a little scary. You saw the roaring river there in the 100-mile wilderness. That if you saw a video of the water, it would be a lot more. So we, you know, somebody said, you know, you figure it out. So there isn't. We're very careful, and if one of us, you know, somebody always speaks up if there's something that we think it's too much. So there's nothing that's too big that we can't go around it, and, you know, things like that. So actually, I was a pilot for 25 years, and if you ask me, private pilot, if you ask me that same question, I would go, well, can't really think of anything too super duper harrowing. There were things.
Ask his wife.
Well, there's the pilot, and then there's the passengers. So you have to calm the passengers down sometimes.
How do you navigate?
So in the early days, it was map and compass and blazes and cairns, and somehow that was better. I mean, it was like who was it? Davy Crockett, who said, they asked him if he ever got lost, and he said something like, I might have been confused a little bit, but I was never lost. That's kind of what it was like. I mean, we didn't know exactly where we were, but we knew where we were. And now you got GPS, so you know exactly where you are. It takes all the fun out of it. But we do it, and so last year they had, in the Wind River Range, they had a terrible windstorm a year or two before, and there were still a ton of blowdowns of giant trees, and there were whole sections of trails. They had cleared out some of it, but they were still clearing it out. So there were whole sections of trails that were unnavigable. So you had to, like I said, there was nothing big enough so that we couldn't go around it. Well, we went around all the downed trees, and then you had to rediscover where the trail was. And Loring would say, "Where's the trail?" And I go, "Over there." And he'd look at his, "Okay, you're correct." The GPS. So some of the, gamesmanship, figuring out things have been ruined by knowing exactly where you are.
I think another question for you. The Sugarloaf Range, does that go over the top of the ski area into the snowfields? Is that where that would be?
Yeah, there wasn't any snow at that point, but yeah.
So,
There was, that was the Appalachian Trail, I think, that went over that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Does it go anywhere near, do you know where the huts are up there?
No, I don't remember, sorry. I know there was a hut, because I think Loring sprained his ankle on that one, and I did a couple of days of hiking in one day to get the car to come around. I think that was that one. Loring, tell me if I'm right. And then they were running the chairlifts because of the fall, the leaves, and I told them it was an emergency, and so I went up the chair. They were really excited. So I went up the chairlift and I started hiking down. Loring had already hiked from the shelter where he was staying with the backpack most of the way up. So he got up there, and then we both went down the chairlift. So
Loring says the trail actually goes around the ski area at Sugarloaf.
yeah. Yeah, he's a skier, so he knows. Any skiing questions, I'm going to refer to him.
I see you did the Mahoosics back in '98. What did you think of the Mahoosics?
We did.
The most difficult part of the Appalachian Trail.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to say that. Now I have backup. So we did the Mahoosic Notch twice. Early on and then later. It is the most difficult 1.5 miles of the Appalachian Trail, and now that both of us are saying it must be true. And you're going over and under, it's jumbled rock that you're going over and under with your backpacks, shoving them through, and it's 1.5 miles, and it takes like 3 hours to do that.
Get through with your pack. You got to put your pack through and then crawl through.
Exactly.
Over and over and over.
It's endless. It's endless.
But the whole range was very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Stacked all the way down through. Really loved it because there was nobody around.
Yeah. And you can tell we loved it because we went twice.
Yeah.
And it took us the same amount of time the second time as the first time. So Loring and I looked at each other and said, "We're not getting old." But, I'm glad you mentioned that. So Mahoosic Notch, memorable. How are we doing for time? Are we still have a couple more minutes?
Yeah, I'm going to show some.
Okay, so I'll show a few more. I had overrun slides here. So this is more of a shelter as you see it when you're hiking up to it. And usually there's some kind of stream there, and then there's the outhouse way up here someplace. And I don't know, if there was one shelter we were at that was kind of like this. We think a tree had hit it, and they took the tree off, but the shelter was, and so I was saying, we're going to sleep there? I think we did, though. But anyway, this gives more of a view of the surroundings of these shelters, which are, gorgeous. Another campsite. This is what we like, camping out on the slick rock, overlooking some giant view, not a tarp to be seen for miles around. And cocktail hour. Sometimes nature isn't so cooperative. And I had to have one snow with the tarp picture in there. The tough part is keeping the water from freezing overnight, so you got to sleep with your water, so you have a drink in the morning, and the snow sort of, Lauren kicks the snow off, or I do it. But there's something really neat about being in a tarp tent in a snowstorm, believe it or not. And part of the reason why we like a tarp too is that we get very claustrophobic. No, that's not the reason. I snore really loudly, so. But sometimes we have to be poor Lauren. We have thousands of pictures. I cried because I had to pick some. So then I came across this one, Continental Divide Trail in Colorado. We got dropped off. We went from 0 to 10,500 feet in one day. And fortunately, we don't seem to have that much difficulty with altitude disease. There are 100 of these pictures. Springs, whenever we come across the spring with the greenery coming out in the desert, it's just so terrific. We've seen several of these things. I think Lauren told me that this one got washed away from some flood, but they grow back. So, but you can see the water streaming down, so that's always a happy sight when you see that. And then I wanted to put in Hans Flat Ranger Station, which is the 45 miles on a dirt road. And this is in the maze. And this is where you have to go. And they sell this book in this ranger station. This book is complaining about how bad the National Park Service was and building roads and making it so accessible, and that was just wrong. And they should be preserving, not destroying. The National Park Service sells this book. So what can I tell you? Oh, and I wanted to show this. This is what the guidebook looks like for the long trail from way back when. So, instead of having this, you had this, which very conveniently fits into your pocket for hiking. So I did want to say that this was a map and compass for back in those days. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hope everybody enjoyed it.